Hello everyone, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes whilst a few more people dial into today's webinar. Whilst we're waiting for the final people to dial in, it would be great to hear who we've got with us today and where you're dialing in from. So on the right hand side of the screen you should find a chat box, and Joe's already said hello. Hello Joe. If you could pop in who you are and where you're joining us from, that would be great. Thank you everyone. We'll just give it 60 seconds and then we'll kick off. So we've got quite a few of you joining us today from far-flung corners of the UK and globally as well. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes and then everybody can dial in. Great, welcome Richard from Essex. Well, they're flying in now, I can't keep up. Anya from Manchester.
We've got Reading,
Linda from Reading,
Finland.
Renee from the US, good morning. Yasmin from Wiltshire, Debbie from Dubai, hi Debbie. Norfolk, Andrew, hi Andrew, how are you doing from Somerset?
Ireland.
Ireland, Essex, Manchester, great. Sounds like we've got a really diverse audience. So I think we'll get started now. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. My name's Andy. I'm one of the principal consultants at the Oxford Group. And we'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is best practice and tips for virtual design and delivery. Here at the Oxford Group and Kineo, we've been supporting clients with virtual learning of all shapes and sizes for many, many years. However, as we've all seen recently, due to unexpected shifts in our ways of working in response to COVID-19, much of our work in recent times has been supporting our clients to move from a traditional face-to-face to a more virtual learning solution. And we know that many of you, from looking at your kind of job roles and your profiles, will know that this isn't just as simple as a lift and shift. There's a lot more to it to make sure, and there's some fundamental design principles to ensure that learning is high quality, engaging and impactful. So today, Stephen and Matt are going to take us through and share as much as they can fit into this afternoon's webinar to help you to think about how you can create some really high quality learning for your people. So I'll hand over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. So my name's Stephen Yates. I'm a facilitator, coach and virtual design expert with the Oxford Group. And I think some of your names, I actually know some of you. So some of us have met before. Welcome, and I'll be facilitating along with Matt. So Matt, hi.
Hi, my name's Matt. I am a learning consultant at Kineo.
Thank you very much, Matt. So moving on to today, and I can see everybody's already pretty confident with the facility on Webinar Jam today, and we'll be primarily working in the text box. So in the text box, bear in mind, you can send to everybody, and there's also a function to send to administration. In other words, our colleague Nathan's in the background helping us with today. So any comments, and certainly whilst you're actually putting messages in, either Andy, Matt or myself, when other people are talking, we'll keep an eye on the messages. So great stuff. So messages are coming in. So that's how we'll be working primarily today, as well as with a poll or two. So, and we've had a look at your comments, which were really interesting as L&D experts for some of you. So I've got a question, an open question for everybody, and put your reaction into the chat box. And I'm sure a lot of you have already had the people coming to you and say, can't we just run the session online? So what's your reaction to that statement? If your boss or your stakeholder just came to you and said, can't we just run the session, the same session online? So put I love it, Joe Cook, no. That's about sums it up. Can't we just run that session online? And it's interesting how people do. Any comments at all in the chat box? But you can start with it. Definitely not.
Interesting.
Despair, Linda.
Yeah, it's not that easy. That's a very good point.
Yeah. Neil, righto. I love this because we're with friends here, Andy.
Here we are, very much so.
So, Jason, certain exercise or activity need to be readapted. Yep, and we're going to talk about that definitely.
Yeah, at least there's a good one here. And how do you think we're going to do that?
No, it needs to be tailor-made. Absolutely. So I'd be quite happy to carry on for the next hour looking at your comments, but we do need to move on. So absolutely, and this is the challenge, isn't it? How do we review that the content? So it's interesting. This is actually old data. I'd never thought I'd be saying that the 12th of March was old data, but in the current new normal that we're in, interestingly, even in the week of the 12th of March, Microsoft Teams saw a 50% increase in that week and an increase in chat use alone. They also saw a 37% increase in using Microsoft Teams for meetings. And I suspect as of now, the 22nd of April, I suspect it's gone up by 100 to 200, whatever percentage. So a huge change in how we're working, not only currently, but I suspect in the future. The Association of Optometrists, interestingly, did some research, studied, and again, although it's not today's research, but pretty current, they found out that, interestingly, a UK internet user visited 2,500 web pages in a month, 81 domains, and 53 sessions in November 2011. And that was from a recent article, interestingly, that was in The Guardian. And according to the Skipton Building Society, we also did some research around learning. We also had 14 minutes as the attention span for adults. So 14 minutes for the attention span for adults. So with that in mind, consider that on an average day, and this would be definitely before we came into where we're at today, we spend more than an average of 7 hours a day staring at the screen. Since 1971, nearsightedness has doubled in the USA, since 71. And I don't know about you, I suspect all of you online there, 97 of you, I suspect you're beginning to wonder that as well, because I know screen time for all of us at the Oxford Group and Kineo has absolutely increased and is virtually feels like 24/7. So these are all the considerations when we're thinking about going virtual. So what are we going to cover today? So a little bit on the challenges and success factors, so your world very much. We'll then talk about what we call the 4 R's, which is reduce, restructure, redesign, and rehearse. So 4 key milestones when we're actually converting face-to-face to virtual. And then we'll have an opportunity for some questions at the end of the session. So what's the purpose? So what do we aim to do is explore and embrace the challenge of going virtual, and hopefully increase your confidence around that. Explore the 4 R's, as I've just mentioned, and also inspire you and to reassure you about transitioning from face-to-face to virtual, and realistically blended learning. So it's not just about being on the screen here, it's also about self-discovery and self-driven learning. What you want your participants to do and say, and they do, and I'm sure some of you have had comments like this from online sessions, and these are true evaluations. I never imagined a virtual workshop could be so interactive. Wouldn't it be great if we could get that from our virtual classrooms? Also, it was really engaging. I didn't have any time to do anything else. We're so familiar with what are people doing in the background, and how do we create something that's as engaging as to people are just completely focused and engaged in the session. So I'm going to open a poll, and so in that poll, I've got a question for you, and Nathan's going to open the poll, which is, how confident do you feel right now about redesigning face-to-face to virtual? So how confident are you at redesigning? So if you'll see that the poll is opening, you might need to click on the poll section. Quick question. So Matt, how did you learn to be confident redesigning? So any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that for me it was really about learning the tools that I had. So knowing what was available and how to use those, and then getting some good practice in with audiences. Obviously, you can start small before you go as big as the audience we've got today.
Yeah.
And also attending sessions like this, so really kind of learning from the experts as to how people react in these situations and how to deal with different size groups.
Absolutely. And I think exploring and trying things out, I will be very transparent as a facilitator. I would say 3 years ago, I would be very anxious about running a session, particularly with nearly 100 people on. And I would have been very, in fact, anxious the night before and not confident. And I think it's about just getting confident, playing with it, and playing with what we have. So I'm just going to close the poll now. So we have 34% are on 6, so 6 out of 10. Nobody's on a 0, great. So we've all got some confidence, and as some of you will be aware, a calibration is best to start with a 1 to 10. We've got possibly 1% of you on the 1, but we're about 5 and 6. If we were to say 45% is around about 6 and 5. So ideally going up to the 10, and that's what we can focus on today. So question. So thanks for the poll on that one. So next question, and in the chat, so I'm going to invite you to, what are the key challenges with virtual training? So we had a look at your comments, and I thought they were really interesting when you signed up, everybody. So you signed up to the session. And I identified 5 key areas of the challenges. And you were talking about, some of you about technology, MS Teams being limited, connectivity, etc. Some of you talked about others, in other words, stakeholders. So convincing stakeholders. Participants themselves, how do you engage participants? The trainer's perspective, us as trainers and facilitators. And also the content. How do you make that content engaging? So Andy, what have we got in the challenges?
We've got quite a few bits, really. I think engagements come through. There's a few platform-specific things. So a couple of people with challenges. So Kay saying that they can only use Skype, so they're limited to what they can do on that platform. Paul Westlake, Westy, how are you doing? You've said breakout rooms can be hard to manage, especially if you don't have the right, the virtual classroom software, the premium software. And then we've got lots coming through. There's a real kind of trend around engagement seems to be the thing that's coming out there. And transitioning facilitators is another thing as well. Those are probably the highlights, Stephen.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. And it's interesting, if we look at the statistics from, and we'll be sending out a PDF, I think goes out after this, with some references to Cindy Huggett, who's one of, I'm sure some of you have heard of Cindy Huggett. She's one of the known experts in the field. And she identified 38% unprepared participants, absolutely. 37% technology. We've got unskilled facilitators, 25%. Lack of buy-in, so from our stakeholders. So these are all common challenges that we're all dealing with, and I suspect are dealing with it even more frequently as of today. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and we know, is when technology is taking over the content, and the tech becomes more important than others. So technology. So Matt, your thoughts about technology and platforms?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's quite a lot of platforms out there at the moment, and sometimes perhaps the kind of barrier there could be perceived in some cases, because I think that even if you've got something that's not a dedicated kind of virtual learning platform, things like Teams, Skype for Business, and Zoom as well do have features in there that you can use. So in some cases it might require a bit of hacking around with like different configurations of stuff that's offline and stuff that's actually within the flow of the meeting in order to do a certain activity. But you can certainly work with what you've got.
Okay, and I know one of Lisa's saying, for example, it's a huge jump for facilitators to move to where the organisation is, and also where you've got, for example, a government agency with limited access to current technology. And we find that quite often with clients that we work with. It's about, as you say, in a sense, being clever with what you do have.
Stephen, just to pick up quickly, yeah, there's a really good point here from Wendy, and I didn't want it to kind of lose the moment, really. And it's about managing technology and delivering at the same time, which is a real challenge. Lots of the stuff that we do, we have producers or we have buddies that are on. So if you're co-facilitating, as we are in a way today, I'm hosting and I'm on the chat and able to engage with people and feed things through so that Stephen and Matt can just focus purely and simply on content delivery. So I think that's a really good point, and using buddying systems and producers can help with that. So thanks for sharing, Wendy.
And I would shadow that and say, I remember the first time, when I would first run online learning, and to actually think about the technology and the content and the participants and the slide decks and what are people doing. And I know one of you said stepping in and out. It's actually about maybe making it much simpler than what we'd normally do with that. So the 4 stages to conversion, and I'll talk very much high sort of top line around 4 key stages that we'd recommend to help get a bit of structure into place, as opposed to just dumping something that would be a face-to-face session online. So first of all, reduce. So we'll talk about reducing the content, identifying the key takeaways and the real key elements of a program. Restructuring. So restructuring, how do we restructure it so that we can use the technology and the platforms we do have? Redesigning the exercises, so redesigning what we would normally do into something that does work interactively and therefore engaging participants. And rehearsing, which normally drops off the radar, and we'll talk about those 4 key elements. So 4 very simple stages to go into. So let's have a look at reducing. So I think we have a clear philosophy, not only at Oxford Group, but I just think it's a good philosophy for all of us as trainers to think about, is yes, do what you do in a face-to-face situation, following the best practice. And by following the best practice, it's about creating connection, creating the questions. We know that we still need to create engagement, so the best practice is going to be creating that at an early stage. So do what you do in a face-to-face. Then put in place additional mechanisms to bridge that physical gap. So what are the mechanisms? And we'll talk about that. Remember, virtual facilitation is not a download of information. It is a partnered group conversation. I think it's good to be clear today, for example, with 96, I see we've got 96 people on board. This is less of an actual virtual learning workshop, and it is a little bit of a sort of combination of both a webinar and a workshop. But we've got some interaction in the chat box. It's a partnered or group conversation. And I think once you get that in your mind, and particularly with the stakeholders, that we're not just going to tell you and show you technical slides or something, we're going to expect people to engage, then let people know that it's actually going to be a conversation. So we've got another poll. So what do you think is the ideal number of participants in an interactive virtual workshop? You will, I suspect, be asked by your stakeholders, just can we not get as many as possible on? Let's hit as many possible people. So let's have a look at a poll. What do you think the ideal number? Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we grapple with this challenge from time to time at the Oxford Group with clients, especially now, trying to get as many participants through as possible. But probably our ideal number is somewhere between 10 and 12, just because engagement's really good at that level. You can create an intimate environment. You can have some good connection with all of the delegates on the programme. But we do programmes up to 16, and we just need to think about the design principles, really.
Absolutely. So 12 would be possibly there. So I'm going to end the poll. We've got most people who've put in. So what we have on the result with the poll is 6 to 8, we got 51% and 39%, excuse me, 12 vote, and a couple of you 16. So yes, we are asked to do virtual learning of 16. We're often asked to do even larger groups, and we do. And as everybody as a trainer or a facilitator will need to push back and say, well, that does change the engagement and the impact. Yes, 12 is an ideal number, particularly if you'll have the ability to enable people to break out into other groups. 6 to 8 is a really good number as well. Be mindful if it's too small, sometimes that can create overemphasis on 1 or 2 participants. So 12 can be a good number. It's a good number to control. On a control list, you can check who's spoken, who's engaged, who's contributed. Anything over 16 and above, it gets quite difficult. So absolutely. And what about ideal length of a virtual workshop? So let's have a look at ideal length of what we would say an ideal workshop would be. So I'm going to share with you so an example here that we've so a classic one-day performance case study. So this session here, what we have here is reduced. We've had a one-day program face-to-face, and we have reduced it to 3.5 hours. It does have a 20-minute break in it, which works really, really well. And what we did is we identified the core tools and the takeaways of that session. So when we talk about the ideal length of a session, so Andy, what are your thoughts about how we, at the Oxford Group, for example, the ideal length of a program, of a session?
Well, as you know, Stephen, we've got a real range of different programs, and it all comes down to the structure and making sure that the content's engaging, and that if it is a slightly longer session, we have on occasions built in larger breaks. So, for example, we transferred a full face-to-face day of delivery. We condensed it down, we reduced the content a little bit, we restructured and took that down to a 5-hour session, which sounds like an awfully long time to be delivering online. But actually, because we broke that up with about 90 minutes of breaks, people were going off, they're having a cup of tea, they were recharging their batteries, they were coming back to it, and the session was extremely engaging. We had breakout rooms going on. So I think it's difficult to say an ideal, I'm not sat on the fence here, but it is difficult to say an ideal length of time. Personally, I enjoy a shorter, sharper online experience, so 90 minutes with maybe a little break in between, but it is possible to do other lengths if you think about the infrastructure and the structure of the session.
Exactly. And something I wanted to mention on the ideal length is, even if you don't have a platform that enables you to go into breakout groups, you might do some input for 60 minutes and then ask people to maybe have an offline conversation, which, whether it's a WhatsApp conversation or a phone conversation, or coach each other, and then come back to another hour maybe later in the day. So I think it's all about that manageable chunks, reducing it and reducing into something that's manageable and keeps people's attention. Remember, we talked about people's attention span being 14 minutes. So just good thought. So it's all about reducing what it is, what are the key elements. And the next thing is about restructuring. And how do you restructure? And it's what we would call a learning architecture of restructuring, and therefore creating something that's more of a blended combination of both online and self-driven learning. So in restructuring, a typical day would create about 3 or 4 webinars. So possibly 3 to 4 webinars, bite-sized chunks, so keeping it bite-sized, creating a logical architecture. So it might be an online session and then offline self-driven learning, then going back to some online, and thinking about, it doesn't just have to be a webinar. People can still do self-driven learning that they can do and then come back and share their observations and insights. And also, of course, to create the cohort in that restructuring, maybe you might have some action learning sets, create some pairs or trios that people can help each other move forward with in order to then come back and do some insights when they come back online next. So I think it can be challenging that we often think, oh, we just have to do it all online. It's a good mixture and a blend. So Matt, I think you've got a bit of a case study, haven't you?
I do indeed. Thank you, Stephen. So here's an example of a blend that we put together at Kineo for ANZ, the bank. And this is an interesting example of how you can take the elements that maybe don't work the best within a group classroom environment and put those into different types of media and different formats. So here, things like basic information transfer was put into e-learning, or in cases where it was mainly best used as reference, that was in paper documents and things like that. And certainly where simulations, where you were getting used to using the banking systems, well, they're not really that effective done in a classroom with lots of people. You can do that on your own. So people were doing that in the form of simulations. And what that really did was focus on a structure where we made best use of that face-to-face time. And then when it came to making sure those activities kind of worked well, making sure that we did a good redesign job on those as well.
Okay, interesting. So making the face-to-face, if there is face-to-face, really impactful. And it's interesting, I see in the message Joss mentioned, hi Joss, so flipped learning. So in other words, get participants to do offline learning before the online, they're prepped, and absolutely. So often we can fall into, especially if we're more used to face-to-face as facilitators, as we are as facilitators, we think, well, it's all got to be interactive and we've got to be talking to people. So absolutely, even paper documents or learning some technology. So it's a good one. So thank you for that. So it is about reframing the mind a little bit about not just doing online, but creating a blended learning option. So then we come into redesign, and this is, and I love the fact that everybody's got some great advice coming up in the chat box. So I can see people, and if you're watching the chat box, there's lots of sharing best practice, and that's the beauty of today's session, is people will be giving people ideas, and particularly on redesign, I suspect. So the next stage is, how do we, so we've talked about reducing it into bite-sized chunks, restructuring it. So what's the structure? How does it look as an architecture of learning, and then redesigning the actual activity of what we might do in face-to-face to work in an online forum. So we have various different ingredients there. So you will see very different sort of exercises that we'd normally do in a face-to-face, whether it's direct questioning, peer coaching, video, and a lot of those elements we might think are quite difficult to do online. Matt, I think there are a couple you're going to talk to us about. I think, is it role play, I think, and also pictures or something?
Yeah, I think a couple of examples of things that might seem a bit hard to do virtually is one of those is role play. That's traditionally a very face-to-face activity. But certainly if you want to do that over a virtual delivery, what you can do is set that role play up as a group. You can break out into separate breakout rooms, have people do role play in smaller pairs or threes, as is sometimes common, and then come back together at the end to discuss what you've learned. So you can certainly do that kind of activity very well in a virtual environment. And also a simple one's drawing a picture. I mean, drawing a picture collaboratively where you get together and mark stuff out and annotate it. I mean, this is one of the most basic tools in that kind of group collaboration platforms. So most of them have a whiteboard of some description, so you can actually draw stuff out together.
Excellent. Okay, and I was so it's interesting. You can bring those to life in the platform, in the virtual platform. So I'm going to talk about the forum theatre. So you've got hot seat practice or forum theatre. So those of you that maybe haven't used forum theatre, that would be where you will have possibly 2 actors or 2 facilitators who would act out a scenario based on the soft skill, particularly behavioural skill that you might be practicing. And in classic forum theatre, what we would then do is the participants will start the actors or facilitators and say, stop, you're not doing it properly, or particularly with challenging conversations or meeting behavior or anything like that. So forum theatre is start, stop, directed primarily by the participants. So you can do forum theatre online. We would have the facilitators online. What you can then do is, and particularly, for example, whether it's on this, where you've got 2 of us talking, you've just seen me and Matt. If you're on Zoom, you could possibly have the 2 people pinned and or highlighted. And you can still do forum theatre, and participants could put comments in the chat box to say, stop, what are you doing? You need to stop, Stephen, and rephrase that statement. So you can still do that demonstration. And interestingly, we, for example, do a demonstration of both coaching online. So we would coach an individual, if you've got a colleague, demonstration of coaching, and particularly virtual coaching. So that's a big piece that is just as powerful. We can demonstrate that. And we can also demonstrate, for example, appreciative inquiry, which some of you will have explored previously. Appreciative inquiry, which is about focusing on the positives, what somebody has done through a coaching style conversation. And we would do that demonstration, and then we ask people to go off and do it in pairs, practice it with each other, a real conversation, and then come back into the WebEx. So there are lots of different ways we can do that. Case study simulation, that would be very good to do a case study offline, come back to the webinar, talk about what you would do in that case study, what the situations are, what's your strategy. So lots of those things can be done. So bit of conversation in the chat box. Polls, so Paul Westlake, polls are a real advantage in virtual delivery. You literally get feedback from everyone in the group, which is rare in a face-to-face. Yes, you get instant feedback on a poll. Absolutely. Anything else, Andy, that you've noticed that was interesting about what we can redesign?
There's a couple of conversation threads about flipped learning. And about how you can use it prior to a session and during a session. I think there was a comment that flipped learning can be a bit difficult sometimes prior to a session, because sometimes people don't do it, and that puts you in a difficult situation as a facilitator with people at different levels of knowledge around a topic. And I mentioned that I've used flipped learning within sessions previously. Where you set up a brief, you set up a task, you get the delegates to go away for an hour and explore that either on their own or as a pair, and then they can come back and you can set up a plenary discussion where people can discuss their findings. So it takes the emphasis off you, as you said earlier, Stephen, having to transmit all the time, actually, and the participants need to go away and do some research for themselves. That can be work quite well from an engagement perspective.
Okay. So interesting. It's just thinking about how can you do that differently, and how can you bring it to life using, for example, some of those virtual interactions that you've got. We're using chat today because of the numbers of people, feedback tools. You might have a tick, a cross, raising hand, emojis. You can have a really good one is you might ask people to put their arrow, how they're doing at the moment, good, so, energized, and they can put their ticks again back to the comment about immediate feedback. Direct questions, I've just put that there because often people say, well, you can't really directly question people, particularly culturally. People may find that challenging. And in the guide that we mentioned that you'll see after this, so long as we frame it and say to people that we will be asking people to contribute, we will be asking somebody in a moment to think about the following. So it's all about framing it. And more importantly, once they do that, they're still engaged and they're still thinking they're going to have to make a contribution. And that's back to the number of people in a group. If it's a smaller group, once somebody's made a contribution, people generally are much more open to talking and sharing online. So, and we've got Menti. Yes, my favorite is a good one. So we've got Menti as something, a great tool for polling. You can do word showers. You have your own account on Menti. And you just do it on the phone if people have their smartphones, which is really powerful. We use a lot of that, or Kahoot as well. So has anybody used those for virtual learning? So there are lots of different elements. Question from Paul: how do you feel about letting people keep the mic open? Assuming, say, 12 people, we'd let them speak. Interesting. So it's a good one. It's about how do you manage the group? Because I agree that sometimes you end up with people talking too much noise. So we generally ask people to go on mute and to come back in. So that's a good point. Andy, anything else on the virtual interaction? We've got, go for it.
Some stuff coming through. I'm just catching up because I was responding to a couple. Nearpod has been mentioned by Daniel. I was just responding to say that sounds good, but I haven't had a chance to have a look at it. So it says you can import a PowerPoint and add various assessment slides in between the pages, such as quizzes, collaborative boards, and games like matching pairs. That sounds really good, actually. So we'll have to have a look at that. And Joe said here, I don't tend to use things like Menti, Kahoot, but I'm usually trying to highlight how creative live online training can be within whatever platform you have. Yeah, sure.
And MS Teams. So with Menti, by the way, guys, you can create your own account free of charge. That does have a limited number of presentations and people, but you can play with it. So it's the sort of thing you can do, you know, I'm sure we've got plenty of time on our hands to muck about at the moment. You can create those and try it. Even with one person, you can try it out and they can click onto that Menti, for example, the word shower, the word cloud, or you can do the polling and you get graphs, etc. So open an account, play with it, and that's how you can start with most of these. You can usually get a free version if you want to try and do that. So redesign recommendations. So this is great stuff. We're getting great stuff on the right hand in the chat box. So think about what platform you're using. So and we would, as learning experts, and all of you as learning experts as well, I would recommend, it's often about pushing back, not getting overcomplicated with the platform. Check the functionality. So be really clear with the functionality and keep it simple. Make sure that the content is impactful, and that's not about making it clever, it's about making it simple. It's often the challenge we have, and we do have at the Oxford Group, is often because we might be doing a 90-minute session as opposed to a whole day, we might have the belief that it's going to be easier to create that. It's usually much longer and much more difficult. As any of you guys know, I'm sure, to make something really simple is always more difficult. It's about editing out and creating impact. Think about the interpersonal contact from you as a facilitator. So how do you create that? How do you make some content, particularly with an actual learning classroom? Smooth tech. So don't let it take over. Be ready. Things will go wrong, and we'll come to that in the rehearsal bit. Things will go wrong. Things, you know, we had in the last session, we did people saying how, I think it was a colleague of ours had a complete power cut, let alone internet going down. So making sure you've got the phone ready to hotspot if you need to go onto 4G if your Wi-Fi goes down. Making sure you know how to reopen the webinar if you need to. And being honest and saying to people, yeah, this could happen. With the technology, one of the things we recommend is ideally have a play session for your participants before you do the webinars. So a completely separate play session, get them used to the platform, get them used to the way you actually navigate, and just get them to muck about with text, the boxes, the chat, the raising hands, get them to play with the platform. And then when it comes to the actual webinar, those participants are already confident. And once people are confident, then there is no worry on the technology. Plan for the unexpected, being aware of timings. I'm going to be very transparent here. I have an old-fashioned manual clock on my desk, and I know where we are with the times, because it's just a simple way of identifying where are we now, how much more time we got left. Be aware, timing online is very different to being in the workshop classroom face-to-face. Build-in breaks, absolutely, build-in breaks. And if you haven't built one and you feel maybe I need to build one in, it might be, should we take a 5-minute comfort break, stay online, come back in 5 minutes, and just let people feel comfortable with that. And build in a stretch. One of the things we often do in a longer session, we actually do a stretch session and say, everybody stand up, do what you want, stretch, move about, just to change that physiological piece. So think about those redesign elements, bringing them into online virtual, and it can be done. Think about your participants. Absolutely. So we've talked quite a lot in a sense about ourselves as facilitators. Think about their level of tech ability. This could be, and I suspect for a lot of you, is the first time they've ever attended a virtual training session or workshop, and it often will be. Launch webinar, as I say, get comfortable with the technology. And pre-work, reframe that and think, well, this is part of the learning. Don't call it pre-work. It is module 1. We call it self-discovery, and it is whether they're doing possibly a psychometric before they come onto the webinar. So maybe it's doing their MBTI or SDI, etc. That is module 1. And we do that particularly, we very successfully, I think, Andy, you might want to, we do 5 conversations where modules in the architecture are pre-work.
That's right. Yeah, we do. Absolutely. So module 1 is fundamental to the learning. It's a foundation cornerstone that sets up the content before people get into the live classroom environment. And we do that with varying different types of learning mode before people ever get in front of one of our facilitators.
Yeah. And check in that they've actually done that. And we as facilitators know when they haven't, because they're asking questions about certain elements. It's like, oh, that's interesting. So you'll always get that challenge, guys. So Matt, we talk about blended all the time. What on earth do we mean blended? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so really blending is when you're using a variety of formats to deliver learning in the best possible format for that particular piece of the puzzle. And it's interesting how you actually start to go around designing this. Obviously, there's a million ways to do anything, but there are some questions that you might want to start asking yourself about the content you've got, especially if you're going from something that's, you know, a whole day or 2 days or 3 days long to a virtual delivery. That's a really good case for a blend. So you might be thinking, and this goes back to the flip classroom points, you know, what do people need to know before a classroom session? You know, what can you give people from a point of revision or getting everybody on the same page where you can? As you said, call it module 1, make sure that people actually take that seriously, and you can do that through, you know, e-learning or curated content. You don't have to create new content necessarily. Find out what's already out there, or perhaps diagnostics where people get some personal understanding before they actually get within the classroom. Other elements, just like with the systems training we were talking about for ANZ, where people might benefit from actually doing that on their own. So that could be where you give people the ability to practice and maybe do simulations or complete workbooks on those kind of more personal tasks where the group environment isn't going to bring a lot of benefit. And again, what else might be better completed away from a classroom, and you can turn those into offline group activities as well. So it could be there are conversations to be had, there could be kind of mentoring style conversations and discussions that can go on outside that main time together. So again, you're focusing that time in the classroom down. And of course, think about how learners can learn from each other. That's something that people are doing extremely well in our chat today by sharing tips and advice. So how can you create that ongoing dialogue that exists all the way through that learning journey for people?
And interestingly, I was going to say something else I'd add to that is there can often be a limiting belief that we have as a facilitator that people need to be in a group all the time. And actually, if we're more extrovert, that might be our limiting belief, but why not have time to learn quietly, read quietly, play with stuff quietly individually? It's just as valid, so which is a good piece there. So it is about, and thanks for that, Matt, it's interesting what blended is. It's about designing something that is a mixture and a combination of all types of learning styles and learning technologies and platforms, which is good. So here's an example of how redesigning. So this is an example of feedback, and I'm sure any of you that have done a session on giving feedback can often be quite a difficult one. So this is an example of, so there's a drawing which, as a facilitator, the facilitator opened in the webinar, had it pre-drawn obviously on the slide deck, and asked, I need some feedback. So as a facilitator, I would ask the participants, I need some feedback in the chat box, be honest. So with that in mind, obviously you as participants today are no doubt thinking, what a dreadful drawing, don't give up your day job. And we encourage those participants to put the comments in the chat box. You're still getting the natural reaction that people are going to do in the workshop face-to-face online. And what was the question that we asked? So the question is, so what's the intention of purpose of that exercise? So the purpose is to enable participants to experience the challenge of not being judgmental. So we want to say, Stephen, your drawing is rubbish. Don't give up your day job. My 5-year-old could do it. So that's the point of that exercise of having a dreadful childlike drawing. So then the question we ask is, how can you create the same learning whilst being virtual, and what tool creates the same reaction? And for this one, for the sake of this, it's a chat box, because it is relatively safe. People can usually voluntarily write something that's maybe a bit critical of the facilitator, and that's about that safe learning environment. And then the facilitator can also read out with support and humor. So that example, we do need them to first create that engagement as to how difficult it is giving feedback about something that you want to be judgmental, and the facilitator can safely support with some humor with that element. So very simple. How do you create it and still using a similar exercise? So 4 stages. So we've looked at reducing the content, creating bite-sized modules, restructuring it, creating what we call a virtual learning architecture, redesigning, so redesign it so that it's actually interactive, still creates the same outcome, still creates the same reaction, and of course then rehearse. So rehearsal always drops off the radar. Classic clangers. So classic clangers, know your tech. So just know your tech. We cannot emphasize that enough. Even we spend most of our time doing virtual learning sessions. We still go back and practice, rehearse, know what's going on with the technology, be confident with the technology. Knowing your words. So what do you actually want to say, whether it's on the slide deck, if you have a slide deck, or whether it's the words we're actually saying, because we don't have that interaction. We don't have the physical interpretation of body language, tone. Yeah, so I can't see what all 84 of you are, how you're reacting or where you are right now. So it's about being conscious. What are the words we're using and how do we land them? And also know your timing. Classic clangers in rehearsal. And we design 90-minute sessions, and it just does not fit into 90 minutes, or it doesn't fit into 2.5. So absolutely, the classic clangers try and rehearse. And we know, as we have, your stakeholders say, well, can we just not do a pilot next week? And we have that every day. Yeah, but we need a bit of time to just get it right, because we don't want it to disengage participants straight away. So we've had a look at rehearsal, we've gone through all the 4, and in a moment we're going to go over to you with a bit more questions. But before we do, 4 key stages to conversion. So reduction, cut it down; removed content, keep the same outcome. Restructuring, make it modular, make it blended, smaller groups, and that can be a challenge, making it bite size. Architecture, and build in a play webinar. And by the way, people love that play webinar. If you can build it in, you'll really get them on board if you can get them to sign up to it. Just a half-hour play. Redesign, convert the material to virtual, design it so that it's interactive. Think about the activities. What's the blend of activities? How many activities do you have? What are the tools you're going to use online? Do they work? And are they supported by your organization? So one example we had, I think Valerie saying, organization not allowing the video meetings, so we have no cameras. So that's not going to be an option, but how can we therefore get different engagement? And build in breaks. Rehearsal, the text, the words, time, tools you use, and more importantly, the platform you're using. Think about the architecture. Paul's asked a question: can I describe a play webinar more? Great question. So literally half an hour of setting up maybe a dummy session with your participants and exploring the whole screen of whichever platform you're using. So play with a whiteboard, play with the text boxes. If we had more time, we would do it with you guys. So I'm sure you can see there's a text pointer, and you can create boxes, text, choose the color, because often you'll find that people don't know how to navigate that menu. And once they're okay with it, and get them to do silly drawings, get them to do text, get them to write stuff, draw pictures, get used to messaging each other. In some cases, on WebEx, you can, and also Zoom, you can message individuals, etc., etc. Maybe get them to share videos, so you can copy and paste a video into a link, opening a different. So playing is literally mucking about on the platform before the real webinar. So I hope that answers, Paul, to that question. So tips for creating. Matt, you're the expert on the blended version.
Yes, there's some things that I would add to the subject of blends, really. And one is really creating a kind of clear learning pathway for people. So be that, the way you name the modules, the way that you make it clear how one thing segues into another is really important, so that people can understand that journey, and kind of what's a core part and what might be extra to that as well, and perhaps optional. Something that I think we've touched on very slightly, but not talked about a lot, is giving people enough time to complete any self-study or any activities basically that you do. So if you've got 2 kind of virtual classrooms, and there's something that you want people to do in between, make sure they've got enough time within their schedules to do that. Definitely something that we've said before, we can't talk about enough, is focusing your group time on activities that really do require a group, and where people are going to get benefit from being together. Whilst also thinking about which elements a learner's going to be actually learning more from doing that on their own, and directing their own learning. And also, do not underestimate the power of situations like this, where you can get people together to share, and they know things that the facilitators don't. Always there's things that we've learned from you today. So exactly. Always give people the opportunity to share their experience and speak.
And even maybe help design a virtual program, a participant
Yeah,
who's got a bit of expertise. We often do that.
indeed.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. So last poll. So Nathan, hopefully, so how confident do you feel now about redesigning face-to-face? Hopefully nobody's gone down. So on a scale of 0 to 10, let's have a look at the poll. We're around about 6 and 5. So I think that's, here we go. Oh, it's going into lovely, great. Oh, going up, 8's going up, down. So we've got quite a few more. 51% we've gone up to sort of 8. We've got 13, 16% on the 9, which is great.
Mm.
Excellent. Okay, so certainly a slight movement. Definitely 44%'s gone up to the 10 and the 9. Going to end the poll now. Thank you very much. So next steps, Andy, what comes out after this briefly?
Okay, so we're going to do questions after, but just before we go into questions, a couple of things just to remind people of. Stephen referenced a PDF guide on designing virtual learning. So we're just finalising that at the moment. That will be out very soon. We'll make sure that's shared with all of you. You'll all get a copy of the recording as well. So if you want to listen back to any of the content, you're more than welcome to. We do a number of events that we're doing at the moment to support organisations. They're all virtual events, obviously, at the moment. We've got 2 coming up, one on managing virtual teams and one on dealing with ambiguity. They're into May. And if you want to sign up for our newsletters, you can sign up both to the Kineo and the Oxford Group newsletters. And we both respectively do varying different events on either leadership, being the Oxford Group side of things, or learning on the Kineo side of things. So please feel free to sign up for other events. You can keep in touch with any of us. Join us on LinkedIn or follow the Oxford Group or Kineo on Twitter as well, just to see what we're doing. So I think we're now going to move on to questions. So I'm going to dive back to the chat and just see if there's anything come through. Let's see.
Any specific questions?
Just I guess a quick question from me, you guys. What is your one top tip? If you had to distill it all down, and you had to give one top tip on designing virtual learning, what would it be? Matt, what about yourself? Sorry to put you on the spot.
For me, it's always thinking about that difference between what works best in a group environment versus what works best as something that you can do on your own, and flipping that classroom has been mentioned in the chat, if you can.
Okay, thanks, Matt. That's great. And Stephen, what about yourself?
Just practice, even whatever you've got, keep practicing, and you'll very quickly learn what you can do, what you can't do, and what to edit out. Just keep practicing, mucking about, playing with it as a facilitator, which is good. So any other questions?
We've had some stuff coming about platforms. There's been quite a lot of mention about Zoom. I think Zoom's quite a prominent platform now that a lot of people have jumped on. I was on a webinar yesterday actually on Zoom, and it was a great experience. It was really, really slick. And I think that it was really slick because the team that were delivering it kept it simple. They kept it to using chat. They had their video cams on. They were really engaging. There was a slide deck, but it wasn't too slide heavy. There was lots of great content coming through.
There was a question, by the way, on where do we sign up for the 2 sessions, and that's on the website, the Oxford Group website. On COVID-19, if you click on there, you'll find there are links to sign up, guys. I think that's right, isn't it, Andy? It
is, yeah. We've got some other links that are going live in the next couple of days. So if they're not up there already, they will be in but certainly by the end of the week.
Good. I think we're good on questions. I think we've learned a lot from your text. So I'm just going to, last thing is think about Cindy Hugg. So she's, I should think, a very busy person at the moment. Cindy Huggett. So there's the book, Virtual Training Tools and Templates, very process driven, which is a really useful starter guide, particularly if you're a beginner. And you'll find the online resources. So you've got, for example, some articles that you can have a look at. Leading Groups Online is obviously a free guide that we'll be doing. Quickly Adapting to Teaching Online is a webcast by Bill Shiano at HBR. So absolutely, guys, go on to HBR. Even if you don't have an account, you can watch videos. I'm sure you've all seen A Conference Call in Real Life. Very funny, old, but always a good one about moving into a conference call. And there's also some other articles around tips for teachers. So bear in mind that teaching is very similar, and you can take still some great content there. So I think we're good. Oh yes, some references just there. So on there's also some book references that we'll put in the guide as well, I believe, is there. So the Cindy Huggett, Clive Shepherd, Learning Online, Roger Corville, Presenter's Handbook for Virtual Presenters, and Casey Labori and Tom Stone, Interaction Engage, for those of us that maybe have got some time to read at the moment, those of us that can concentrate. Excellent. So I think we're good.
We're good. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and thank you to Matt and to Stephen for your contributions.
Thank you, Matt and Andy, and thanks, Nathan, for your support. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.